You think wearing that badge makes you right? The words cut through the late afternoon air, sharp enough to turn heads before the siren lights even finished flashing red and blue across the glass storefronts. And for a second the entire street seemed to hold its breath as Officer Daniel Reeves stepped closer, his boots heavy against the concrete, his jaw tight, his voice louder now, louder than it needed to be. "Step back, ma'am. I'm giving you a direct order." And people began to slow, then stop, phones rising one by one like quiet witnesses, their screens glowing faintly in the fading daylight, while Nia Brooks stood exactly where she was, not moving, not raising her voice, just standing there in a plain gray sweater and worn sneakers, her hands visible, her posture steady, as if the noise around her couldn't quite reach where she was standing, and the reflection of the patrol car lights slid across her face, red then blue then red again, painting her calm expression in flickers of urgency that didn't match her breathing. Because her breathing was slow, controlled, the way someone breathes when they've practiced not reacting, when they've learned that reacting only feeds the fire. And somewhere behind her a car honked, impatient, ignored, as Reeves exhaled sharply and shook his head like he'd already made up his mind about her, like the story was already written in his head before she ever opened her mouth. "You said your father is Special Forces?" he asked. But the question wasn't really a question, it was a challenge, a dismissal wrapped in a uniform. And a few people in the crowd exchanged looks, subtle, uncertain, because something about the way Nia held herself didn't quite match the assumption being thrown at her. But Reeves didn't notice that, or didn't care to, because authority, when it's certain, rarely looks for contradiction, and he gestured toward the curb with a quick motion. "I'm going to need you to step aside and provide identification." And his hand hovered just slightly forward, not touching, but close enough to suggest he could, close enough to make the space feel smaller than it was, and Nia's eyes lifted to meet his, not defiant, not afraid, just steady. And for a fraction of a second something flickered across his expression, something almost like hesitation, but it vanished as quickly as it came, replaced by the same firm certainty he'd started with. And the city noise crept back in around them, a low hum of engines and distant voices, the smell of asphalt still warm from the day's heat rising faintly into the air. And Nia finally spoke, her voice quiet but clear enough to carry. "My father trained men like you." And the sentence didn't come out as a threat or a boast. It landed like a fact, simple, grounded, and that made it heavier than if she had shouted it, because it didn't ask for belief, it didn't try to convince, it just existed. And Reeves let out a short laugh, not loud, but sharp, the kind of laugh meant to close a conversation rather than open one. "Yeah, I'm sure he did," he replied, shaking his head again as if brushing off something insignificant. And somewhere to the left a woman lowered her phone just slightly, her brow furrowing, while a man in a baseball cap whispered something under his breath, the words lost in the air but the tone unmistakable, uncertainty beginning to ripple through the edges of the crowd. And Nia didn't move, didn't repeat herself, didn't reach for anything. She just stood there with her shoulders relaxed and her chin level, the faint breeze catching a loose strand of her hair and lifting it for a moment before letting it fall again, and the stillness of her contrasted so sharply with the flashing lights and the rising tension that it made the entire scene feel unbalanced, like something unseen was waiting just outside the frame. And Reeves shifted his weight, his radio crackling softly at his shoulder with a burst of static that neither of them acknowledged. And for a brief second, barely noticeable, his eyes flicked past her, scanning the street behind as if expecting something, or someone. And then he refocused, his tone tightening again. "Last warning," he said, and the words hung there, suspended, heavier than before, as the crowd leaned in without realizing it, as the light shifted slightly with the lowering sun, casting longer shadows across the pavement. And Nia inhaled once, slow and measured, her gaze never leaving his, her voice softer now, but somehow even more certain. "You should listen before you decide what's true." And she didn't step forward, didn't step back. She simply remained, grounded in a way that made the space around her feel anchored. And for the first time since he'd arrived, Officer Reeves didn't immediately respond. The silence stretching just long enough to be noticed, just long enough for the sound of an approaching engine somewhere down the block to slip into the moment, low and steady, not urgent, not loud, just present. And though no one turned yet, though no one said anything, something in the air shifted, subtle but undeniable, like the beginning of a change no one had planned for. The low hum of the approaching engine grew just a little louder, not enough to draw attention on its own, but enough to slip beneath the surface of the moment like a second heartbeat. And Nia heard it even if she did not turn her head, even if her eyes stayed fixed on Officer Reeves, because she had learned a long time ago how to listen without looking, how to notice without reacting. And across from her, Reeves shifted again, his fingers brushing the edge of his belt as his radio crackled once more. Unit 12, confirm status, the voice said, flat and distant, and he pressed the button quickly, almost too quickly. All clear, he replied, his tone clipped, controlled, but something in it was tighter now, less certain than before, and one of the bystanders, a middle-aged man in a work jacket, leaned slightly toward another and murmured, "Does not look all clear to me." And the words were quiet, but they carried just enough to ripple through the small crowd, because now people were not just watching, they were interpreting, and that changed things, that shifted the balance in a way no one announced but everyone felt. And Nia let out a slow breath, her shoulders rising and falling with a calm that did not match the tension in the air, and for a moment her gaze drifted past Reeves, not fully turning, just enough to register the movement at the far end of the block, a dark vehicle easing into view without flashing lights, without urgency, just steady, deliberate. And then she looked back at him, as if that detail did not matter, as if nothing had changed, and that, more than anything, unsettled him, because people who knew they were about to be proven right usually showed it. They shifted, they glanced, they prepared, but she did none of that. She simply stood there, grounded, and Reeves cleared his throat, the sound sharper than he intended. "Ma'am, I am not going to repeat myself," he said, louder again, as if volume could restore control. "Step aside and show me your identification." And his words were firm, but they no longer landed with the same weight, because the silence that followed them was different now, heavier, filled with expectation rather than compliance. And somewhere behind Nia a young woman whispered, "Why is he pushing so hard?" And no one answered her, but a few heads tilted, a few expressions shifted, and the air grew thicker with unspoken questions. And Nia's hands remained visible at her sides, her fingers relaxed, not clenched, not defensive, just present. And she spoke again, her voice even, measured. "I am not refusing," she said. "I am asking you to listen." And the sentence did not challenge his authority, it reframed it. It placed the responsibility back in his hands in a way that made it harder to ignore. And Reeves blinked once, just once, as if recalibrating, and his eyes flicked again down the street, this time lingering half a second longer. And the engine sound was clearer now, closer, the vehicle slowing as it approached the edge of the scene, but still no one turned. Not yet, because the center of gravity was still here, still between the two of them. And the radio at his shoulder crackled again, softer this time. A burst of static followed by a voice that cut out before forming words, and he frowned slightly, adjusting it with his hand. And in that small distraction the crowd leaned in just a fraction more, drawn by the shift, by the possibility that something was about to happen. And Nia noticed it, not the people themselves but the change in energy, the way attention gathered, and she stayed exactly as she was. Her posture unchanged, her breathing steady, because she did not need the crowd, she did not rely on them. And that independence, that quiet certainty, made the moment feel even more unbalanced. And Reeves exhaled slowly through his nose, his jaw tightening, as if he was choosing his next move carefully now, weighing it in a way he had not before. And for the first time since he had raised his voice, he lowered it slightly, not enough to be soft, but enough to be controlled. "You are making this more complicated than it needs to be," he said, and the statement sounded less like an accusation now and more like a warning to himself. And Nia met his gaze without hesitation, her expression unchanged, and for a brief second neither of them spoke, the silence stretching, filled only by the distant engine now coming to a stop somewhere just out of frame, and the faint sound of a car door opening, subtle, almost lost beneath the ambient noise of the street, but present. And though no one reacted immediately, though no one pointed or turned, something shifted again, deeper this time. like the ground itself had adjusted beneath their feet, and Reeves felt it even if he could not name it, his posture stiffening slightly, his attention splitting between what was in front of him and what might be behind, and Nia remained still, her voice quiet when she finally spoke again, softer than before, but carrying just as clearly. You still have time to choose how this ends. And the words did not sound like a threat, they sounded like an offer, and that made them harder to dismiss. And as the last trace of the engine noise faded into the background, the moment held, suspended, waiting for something or someone to step fully into it. The sound of the car door closing was soft, almost too soft to belong to something important, yet it landed in the silence like a marker, a quiet line drawn beneath everything that had just been said, and for a moment no one moved. Not the crowd, not Officer Reeves, not even Nia, because the weight of that sound did not demand attention, it invited it, and that made it more powerful than sirens ever could be. And Reeves felt it before he understood it. His shoulders tightening just slightly, his eyes shifting again past Nia, this time holding there a fraction longer, and something in his expression changed, not fully, not openly, but enough that the certainty he had been leaning on began to thin at the edges, and behind Nia the air seemed to part as footsteps approached, steady, measured, not rushed, not hesitant, just precise. Each step landing with the kind of quiet confidence that did not need to announce itself, and still she did not turn. Her gaze remaining on Reeves, her posture unchanged, as if she had already decided that whatever was coming did not require her reaction, and that choice, that refusal to look, made the moment stretch even tighter, because now it was not about what was arriving. It was about how he would respond before he even saw it clearly, and Reeves swallowed once, a small motion, barely visible, but enough to betray the shift happening beneath his uniform, and the crowd began to notice it too, the subtle hesitation, the way his stance adjusted, and a few phones tilted slightly to capture a wider frame, as if instinctively preparing for something they could not yet name, and then a voice, calm and low, entered the space from behind Nia, not loud, not demanding, but carrying with it a clarity that cut through everything else. "Officer," the man said, and the single word landed differently than any raised voice could have, because it did not compete, it did not escalate, it simply existed with authority, and Reeves turned fully now, his body pivoting before his mind caught up, and when he saw the man standing a few feet behind Nia, something in his face tightened again, sharper this time, more immediate, because the details registered all at once, the posture, the bearing, the uniform that was not loud but unmistakable, pressed clean, worn with familiarity rather than display, and the insignia that caught the fading light just enough to be seen without needing to be pointed out, and for a brief second Reeves said nothing, his mouth parting slightly as if to speak, then closing again as he recalibrated, and the man stepped forward one pace, no more, stopping at a respectful distance. That somehow still shifted the center of the entire scene, and Nia exhaled softly, the first visible change in her since the moment began, not relief, not tension, just a quiet acknowledgement, and still she did not turn around, because she did not need to, and that detail did not go unnoticed, not by the crowd, not by Reeves, and certainly not by the man who had just arrived, whose eyes moved briefly from the officer to the back of his daughter's head, then back again, and when he spoke his tone remained even, controlled. "Is there a reason you are raising your voice at her?" he asked, and it was not phrased as an accusation, not directly, but the weight behind it made it impossible to ignore, and Reeves straightened instinctively, his shoulders pulling back, his stance adjusting in a way that looked almost automatic, and he cleared his throat, the earlier sharpness in his voice replaced now by something more measured, more careful. "Sir, I was conducting a routine check," he said, each word chosen with more precision than before, and the man nodded once, a small, deliberate motion, as if acknowledging the statement without fully accepting it, and the silence that followed was no longer tense in the same way. It had shifted into something quieter, heavier, filled with observation rather than confrontation, and the crowd felt it, the change in tone, the lowering of volume, the way authority was being redefined without anyone announcing it. And Nia finally turned then. Slowly, her movement unhurried, her eyes lifting to meet her father's for just a second, And in that brief exchange, something unspoken passed between them, something rooted in trust, in understanding, in years of lessons that did not need to be repeated here. And then she looked back at Reeves, her expression unchanged, her voice calm as she added, "I told you he would come." And the words did not carry triumph, did not carry accusation. They simply closed the space between what had been said and what was now undeniable, and Reeves glanced between them, the pieces aligning in real time, the earlier certainty dissolving into something far more complicated, and the red and blue lights still flashed across the pavement. But they no longer felt like the center of the scene. They felt like background, like something left over from a moment that had already passed. And as the last echo of movement settled into stillness, no one spoke, because for the first time since it began, the situation did not need more words to define it. For a long second, no one moved, not because they were told to stop, but because something in the air had quietly shifted control away from noise and into presence. And Colonel Isaiah Brooks did not raise his voice, did not step closer than necessary. Yet the space seemed to reorganize itself around him as if it recognized something that did not need to be explained. And Officer Reeves stood straighter now, not out of fear, not even out of respect fully formed yet, but out of instinct, the kind that surfaces before thought has time to catch up. And the faint hum of the city returned in fragments, a passing car, a distant siren blocks away, the rustle of clothing as someone adjusted their stance in the crowd, and still no one spoke, because whatever had been unfolding no longer needed escalation, it needed clarity. And Brooks let the silence sit for just a moment longer before he spoke again, his tone unchanged, steady, controlled. "You said this was a routine check," he repeated, not as a challenge, but as a point of focus. And Reeves nodded once, his jaw tightening slightly as he chose his words with care now. "Yes, sir. I received a call about a disturbance, and when I arrived, I found—" He paused briefly, his eyes flicking toward Nia and then back, recalibrating mid-sentence. "I found her refusing to step aside when instructed." And the phrasing was cleaner now, more neutral, stripped of the earlier edge. And Brooks listened without interruption, his gaze steady, his posture relaxed but grounded. And when Reeves finished, the colonel tilted his head just slightly, a small motion that carried more weight than a larger gesture would have. "Refusing?" he echoed quietly. And then his eyes shifted to Nia for a brief moment, not questioning, not correcting, simply acknowledging, before returning to Reeves, or asking to be heard. He added, and the distinction settled into the space between them like a quiet correction, not loud enough to embarrass, but precise enough to be undeniable. And Reeves inhaled slowly, his shoulders rising and falling as he processed that, and the crowd felt it too. The shift from confrontation to evaluation, from assumption to reconsideration, and a woman near the front lowered her phone just slightly, her expression softening, as if she was witnessing something more than just a public dispute. And Nia stood with the same calm she had held from the beginning, her hands still at her sides, her gaze moving briefly between the two men, not seeking validation, not pressing advantage, just present. And Brooks took one small step forward, closing the distance just enough to engage without invading. "My daughter," he said, and the words were simple, but the way he said them carried layers of meaning, identity, responsibility, connection, "has been taught to speak carefully," he continued, "and to stand still when others would rather she move." And his eyes remained on Reeves as he spoke, not accusatory, not aggressive, but clear. And Reeves swallowed once, his earlier certainty now fully replaced by something more measured, more aware, and he nodded again, slower this time. "Understood, sir," he replied, and the response came out almost automatically, the formality slipping in without resistance. And Brooks gave a slight nod in return, acknowledging the shift without drawing attention to it. And then he glanced briefly at the patrol car, the flashing lights still painting the pavement in alternating colors, before looking back at Reeves. "Then let us keep this routine," he said, and the phrasing was deliberate, an invitation rather than a command. And Reeves exhaled quietly, the tension in his shoulders easing just a fraction, and he reached for his notepad, his movements now controlled, procedural, as if returning to familiar ground. "Yes, sir," he said again, and then, turning slightly toward Nia, His tone changed once more, softer, more professional. "Ma'am, may I see your identification?" And the question, though similar in content to what he had asked before, landed differently now, stripped of assumption, grounded in respect, and Nia nodded once, her hand moving calmly to retrieve her wallet, the motion unhurried, deliberate, and as she handed over her identification, her fingers did not tremble, her posture did not shift, because she had never needed the moment to change. She had only needed it to reveal itself, and Reeves accepted the card with a brief glance, his eyes scanning it quickly before returning it, his expression composed but quieter now, and the crowd began to disperse slightly, the tension that had drawn them in dissolving into something more ordinary, conversations resuming in low tones, phones lowering as the need to record faded, and Brooks stepped back half a pace, giving space without disengaging, his presence still anchoring the scene even as it settled, and for a brief moment, just before everything returned fully to normal, Reeves looked at Nia again, not with suspicion, not with dismissal, but with something closer to recognition, and though he did not say it out loud, the shift was there, visible in the way his posture softened, in the way his voice had changed, and in the silence that followed, where no one needed to explain what had just happened, because it had already spoken for itself. The last flicker of red and blue lights stretched across the pavement as Officer Reeves stepped back toward his patrol car, his movements slower now, more deliberate, as if each step carried a weight he had not felt when he first arrived, and the crowd, once tight and expectant, began to loosen into fragments of everyday life again. People turning away, conversations resuming in low tones, the quiet hum of the street reclaiming its place. Yet something lingered in the air, something unspoken, that had settled deeper than the moment itself, and Nia stood where she was for a second longer, her hands resting loosely at her sides, her breathing steady, her eyes following Reeves only briefly before shifting back to her father. And Colonel Isaiah Brooks looked at her not with concern, not with urgency, but with a calm recognition, the kind that comes from understanding without needing explanation, and he gave a small nod, almost imperceptible, but enough, and Nia returned it with the same subtlety, a silent exchange that carried more than words ever could, and for a moment neither of them spoke, because nothing needed to be fixed, nothing needed to be undone, it had already passed, and the lesson, whatever it was, had already taken its place, and Brooks finally broke the silence, his voice low, steady. "You held your ground," he said, not as praise, not as surprise, but as a simple acknowledgement, and Nia exhaled softly, her shoulders relaxing just a fraction. "You told me to," she replied, and there was no defiance in her tone, no pride either, just truth, and Brooks allowed the corner of his mouth to lift slightly, not quite a smile, but close enough to soften the lines of his face, and he glanced once more toward the patrol car, where Reeves now stood with one hand resting on the open door, his posture still composed but quieter, his gaze lowered for a brief moment before he looked up again. And when their eyes met across the distance, there was no tension left, no challenge, just a silent recognition that something had shifted, and Reeves gave a small nod, almost reflexive, and Brooks returned it with the same measured restraint, and that exchange, brief as it was, carried the weight of something larger than the moment, something that did not need to be spoken aloud to be understood, and Nia watched it without comment, her expression unchanged, but there was a softness in her eyes. Now, a quiet release of the tension she had held so carefully, and as the patrol car door closed with a muted thud, the sound no longer sharp, no longer intrusive, it felt like the final punctuation to something that had already been decided, and Reeves stepped into the driver's seat, the engine turning over with a low rumble before the vehicle eased back into the flow of traffic, the flashing lights now dimmed, blending into the rhythm of the city rather than dominating it, and as he drove away, he glanced once more in the rearview mirror, just for a second, catching the image of the two figures standing side by side on the sidewalk, steady, grounded, unchanged by his departure, and something in his expression shifted again, not dramatically, not visibly to anyone else, but enough to register within himself, a quiet recalibration of what he had assumed and what he now understood, and back on the sidewalk, Brooks turned slightly toward Nia, his hands resting loosely at his sides, His posture relaxed now that the moment had passed, and the evening light softened around them, the sun dipping lower, casting long shadows that stretched across the concrete. And he spoke again, his voice carrying the same calm weight it always had. "Power is not in how loud you speak," he said, pausing just briefly before continuing. "It is in how steady you remain when others expect you to break." And Nia listened, not because she had not heard it before, but because hearing it now, after what had just happened, gave the words a different texture, a deeper resonance, and she nodded once, her gaze drifting down the street where the patrol car had disappeared, and then back to him. He did not listen at first, she said quietly, and Brooks tilted his head slightly, considering that. "Most people do not," he replied. "Not when they think they already understand." And the statement hung between them, not heavy, not bitter, just real, and the city moved on around them, footsteps passing, distant voices rising and falling, the ordinary rhythm of life continuing as if nothing had happened. And yet for those who had witnessed it, for those who had paused long enough to see it unfold, something small but significant had shifted, a reminder that presence can outweigh noise, that calm can reshape conflict, and that dignity, when held firmly enough, does not need to be defended, it reveals itself. And Nia took a slow breath, the tension fully leaving her shoulders now, and she turned slightly, beginning to walk alongside her father, their steps naturally falling into rhythm, not hurried, not delayed, just steady. And as they moved away from the spot where everything had unfolded, there was no need to look back, because what had mattered was not the confrontation itself, but what it had uncovered, and that did not stay behind. It moved with them, quiet, grounded, and certain. The rhythm of their footsteps settled into the quiet cadence of early evening as they moved down the sidewalk, the tension of the moment fading behind them, but not disappearing entirely. Because some moments do not end when the scene changes. They follow, they echo, they linger in the spaces between breaths, and Nia felt it in the way her chest rose a little slower now, in the way her fingers relaxed fully at her sides, no longer holding that invisible line she had drawn for herself back there. And beside her, Colonel Isaiah Brooks walked with the same measured pace he had carried into the scene, unchanged, steady, as if nothing about him needed to adjust for what had just happened. And that constancy grounded the air around them, made the city noise feel softer, less intrusive, and for a few seconds they said nothing, letting the sound of passing cars and distant conversations fill the space naturally, until Nia glanced slightly toward him, her voice quiet but thoughtful. "Did you hear everything?" she asked, not because she doubted it, but because she wanted to understand how much he had seen without being seen. And Brooks nodded once, his eyes forward, scanning the street in that subtle way that never turned off. "Enough," he replied, and there was a faint shift in his tone, not concern, not pride, but something closer to reflection, and he added after a brief pause, "You did not raise your voice." And Nia let out a small breath that almost sounded like a soft laugh, though it held no humor. "You told me that is when people stop listening," she said, and Brooks gave a slight nod, acknowledging the lesson without repeating it. And they walked another few steps before he spoke again, his voice carrying the same calm precision. "What made you stay?" he asked, and the question was simple, but it reached deeper than the situation itself. And Nia took a moment before answering, her gaze drifting ahead to where the sidewalk stretched under the warm glow of streetlights, beginning to flicker on. "Because if I moved," she said slowly, "it would have meant he was right about me." And the words settled between them, clear, grounded, and Brooks glanced at her then, just briefly, his expression unreadable to anyone else. But to her it held a quiet acknowledgement, a recognition of something learned and applied in real time, and he nodded once more. "And was he?" he asked, not to challenge, but to complete the thought, and Nia shook her head gently. "No," she replied, her voice steady, and the simplicity of that answer carried more weight than any explanation could have. And they continued walking, their steps aligned, their presence moving through the city, without drawing attention now, just two figures among many. And yet the moment they carried with them felt distinct, defined, like a line drawn not in the street, but in understanding. And after a few more seconds Brooks spoke again, his tone softer now, less instructive, more reflective. People like him, he said, choosing his words carefully. They are trained to react quickly, to control what they see before they understand it. And Nia listened, her eyes focused ahead, absorbing the words. Not as new information, but as confirmation of what she had just experienced. And Brooks continued. But control without understanding is fragile. And he let that sit for a moment before adding. It breaks the moment something real steps into it. And Nia thought about that. About the way Reeves had shifted, the way his voice had changed, the way the certainty had faded from his posture, and she nodded slightly. He did not expect you, she said, and Brooks allowed a faint breath of acknowledgement. He did not expect you, he corrected gently, and that subtle shift in phrasing carried a different meaning, one that made Nia glance at him again, her brow tightening just slightly as she processed it. And he met her gaze briefly, just enough to anchor the point. I did not change that moment, he said. You did. And the statement was not delivered as encouragement, not as praise, but as fact. And that made it land deeper, because it removed any doubt, any room for deflection. And Nia looked forward again, her expression thoughtful now, the weight of that realization settling in, and the streetlight above them flickered fully on, casting a steady glow across the sidewalk, illuminating their path without drawing attention, and the city continued around them, unchanged. Yet for Nia something had shifted internally, something quiet but permanent, and she exhaled slowly, her voice softer when she spoke again. I was not waiting for you, she admitted, and Brooks gave a slight nod, as if he had already known. I know, he replied, and the two words carried a depth of understanding that needed no expansion. And they walked on, their steps steady, their presence calm, moving forward. Without urgency, because the moment behind them had already done what it needed to do, and what remained now was not conflict, not tension, but clarity, the kind that does not demand attention, only recognition. And in that quiet, steady rhythm, the lesson settled fully into place, not spoken aloud, not emphasized, but understood all the same. The streetlights had fully come alive now, casting a soft amber glow across the sidewalk as the evening settled into its quieter rhythm. And Nia could feel the shift not just around her, but within her, a subtle recalibration that did not announce itself, but made everything feel a little more grounded, a little more clear. And beside her, Colonel Isaiah Brooks walked with the same steady presence, his pace unchanging, his posture relaxed but alert in that quiet way that never seemed to leave him. And for a while they moved without speaking, letting the city breathe around them, the distant hum of traffic blending with the occasional footsteps of passers-by, until the faint buzz of a phone broke the stillness, soft but insistent, and Nia reached into her pocket, pulling it out and glancing at the screen where a message notification lingered, and she hesitated for just a second before opening it, her eyes scanning quickly, her expression tightening slightly, not with fear, not with stress, but with something more thoughtful, more reflective. And Brooks noticed it without looking directly, the way he always seemed to notice things without needing to turn his head. Something else, he asked, his tone neutral, not pressing, and Nia let out a small breath, her thumb hovering over the screen before she locked it again. Someone recorded it, she said, her voice calm but quieter now, and Brooks nodded once, as if that outcome had already been expected, because in a world where moments unfolded in public, they rarely stayed there. They moved, they spread, they became something else entirely, and Nia continued after a brief pause. It is already being shared, and there was no panic in her voice, no urgency, just an awareness of what that meant, of how quickly a single moment could take on a life of its own beyond the people who had lived it. And Brooks finally glanced at her then, his expression composed, steady. And what do you think it will show? He asked. And the question was simple, but it carried weight, because it was not about the video itself, it was about perspective, about interpretation, and Nia thought about it for a second, her gaze drifting ahead as they passed under another streetlight, the glow catching the edge of her profile. It will show him yelling, she said slowly, and me standing still, and she paused briefly before adding, but it will not show why, and Brooks gave a slight nod, acknowledging the truth in that. The limitation of what could be captured versus what was actually understood, and they walked a few more steps before he spoke again, his voice thoughtful now. Most people will not look for why, he said. They will decide based on what is easiest to see. And Nia absorbed that, her grip tightening just slightly around her phone. Then it will not be the full story, she replied. And Brooks exhaled softly, not disagreeing, but not correcting either. No story ever is, he said, and the statement settled between them with a quiet finality. And for a moment the weight of that reality pressed in, not heavy, not overwhelming, but present, and Nia glanced down at her phone again, her reflection faint in the dark screen, and she thought about the faces in the crowd, the angles of the cameras, the snippets of audio that would be replayed and interpreted and judged by people who had not been there from the beginning, and she felt a flicker of something rise in her chest, not anger, not fear, but something closer to uncertainty, and she let out a slow breath, grounding herself. Again, does it matter? She asked, and the question came out quieter than before, more introspective, and Brooks did not answer immediately, his gaze forward, his step steady, and after a few seconds he spoke, his voice carrying that same calm certainty that had anchored the earlier moment. It matters if you let it define you, he said, but not if you understand what actually happened. And Nia listened closely, the words settling deeper than the situation itself, and he continued, "You cannot control what people see," he added, "only how you stand when they are watching." And that distinction, simple as it was, shifted something in her again, reframing the concern into something more manageable, more grounded, and she nodded slowly, her shoulders easing as the tension that had briefly returned began to fade, and they turned onto a quieter street now, the noise of the main road softening behind them, replaced by the gentle rustle of trees and the occasional hum of a passing car. And Nia slipped her phone back into her pocket, her hands returning to her sides, relaxed, present, and after a moment she spoke again, her voice steadier now. "Then I will let them see what they want," she said, "because I know what it was." And Brooks glanced at her briefly, a faint approval in his expression that did not need to be spoken, and he nodded once. "That is enough," he replied, and the two words carried a quiet certainty that settled everything into place. And as they continued walking, their steps aligned, their presence calm, the moment that had once drawn a crowd now reduced to a memory, to a recording, to something that would move through the world in fragments. But for them it remained whole, understood, and that understanding, quiet and steady, was something no recording could capture, no interpretation could alter, because it did not live outside of them. It moved with them, grounded, unchanged, and certain. The quieter street carried a different kind of sound, softer, more contained, the rustle of leaves brushing lightly against each other in the evening breeze, the distant hum of a passing car fading quicker than before, and Nia noticed how her steps adjusted. Without her thinking, slower now, less guarded, as if her body had finally accepted that the moment behind her had truly ended, and yet her mind continued to turn it over, not replaying it, but studying it, the way one studies something that revealed more than expected. And beside her, Colonel Isaiah Brooks remained steady, his presence unchanged, his gaze forward but aware, and for a few seconds neither of them spoke, the silence no longer heavy, just present, until Nia let out a quiet breath, almost like a release she had been holding back without realizing, and she spoke, her voice thoughtful. "He believed he was right," she said, not as a question, not as an accusation, but as an observation, and Brooks nodded slightly. "Most people do when they raise their voice," he replied, his tone calm, almost reflective, and Nia glanced down briefly at the pavement beneath her feet, watching the way the streetlights stretch their shadows long and narrow ahead of them. "Even when they are not," she added, and Brooks allowed a faint pause before answering. "Especially then," he said, and the quiet certainty in his voice settled into her thoughts, reshaping the moment once more, and they walked a few more steps before she spoke again, her tone shifting just slightly, more introspective now. "I kept thinking if I said more, if I explained it better, he would understand," she admitted, and Brooks glanced at her briefly, his expression steady. "And why did you stop?" he asked, and Nia took a second to consider that, her brow tightening just slightly as she searched for the right words. "Because I realized he was not listening to understand," she said slowly. "He was listening to respond." And Brooks gave a small nod. the kind that confirmed a lesson rather than introduced one. That is the difference, he said, between conversation and control. And the words landed with a quiet clarity that made Nia's steps slow just a fraction, her mind settling more firmly into what had actually happened. And the breeze shifted again, cooler now as the evening deepened, brushing lightly against her face, and she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, her fingers moving with an ease that had not been there earlier. And for a moment she said nothing, letting the realization settle fully, before asking, her voice softer, "So what do you do when someone is not listening?" And Brooks did not answer immediately, his gaze lifting slightly, as if considering the question not just in theory but in memory. And after a few seconds he spoke, his tone measured, deliberate. "You decide whether the moment is for them," he said, "or for you." And Nia frowned slightly, not in confusion, but in concentration. "And if it is not for them?" she asked, and Brooks looked at her then, meeting her eyes directly. "Then you stop trying to change them," he replied. "And you make sure you do not change yourself." And the simplicity of the statement carried a weight that settled deep, because it shifted the focus entirely, away from the other person, away from the conflict, and back onto something she could actually control. And Nia nodded slowly, her shoulders easing further as the tension she had not fully recognized began to dissolve. And they continued walking, their steps steady, the rhythm of the street matching the calm that had returned between them. And after a moment she spoke again, her voice quieter now, almost reflective. "I thought standing there was about proving him wrong," she said, and Brooks tilted his head slightly. "And now?" he asked, and Nia exhaled softly, her gaze lifting ahead as the next streetlight came into view, casting another pool of warm light across their path. "Now I think it was about not letting him decide who I was in that moment," she said, and Brooks allowed the faintest hint of a smile, not broad, not obvious, but enough to soften his expression. "That is a stronger position," he said, and the words did not feel like praise, they felt like confirmation, like something aligning into place. And Nia let out another slow breath, the kind that settles fully into the chest. And for the first time since the encounter began, she felt not just calm, but clear, the kind of clarity that does not come from winning or losing, but from understanding what mattered and what did not. And the street stretched ahead of them, quiet, steady, unchanged. And as they walked forward, the moment behind them no longer felt like something that needed to be carried. It felt like something that had already done its work, something that had revealed what it needed to reveal. And in that quiet, steady movement, the lesson settled fully, not as something she needed to remember, but as something she had already become. The street ahead narrowed slightly as they turned onto a quieter block, the kind where the sounds of the city softened into a distant backdrop rather than something pressing in from all sides. And Nia noticed how the air felt different here, cooler, more still, carrying the faint scent of damp concrete and trimmed grass from somewhere nearby. And her steps slowed just enough to match the calm settling inside her. The earlier tension now replaced by something more reflective, more grounded. And beside her, Colonel Isaiah Brooks remained steady, his presence unchanged, but there was a subtle shift in the way he walked now, less alert, more at ease, as if he too recognized that the moment had fully passed. And for a few seconds neither of them spoke, letting the quiet settle naturally, until Nia broke it, her voice softer now, more inward. "Do you ever get used to it?" she asked, and the question hung there, not fully defined, but clear enough in its meaning. And Brooks glanced at her briefly before looking forward again, his expression thoughtful. "To what?" he asked, not because he did not understand, but because he wanted her to say it. And Nia exhaled slowly, her gaze drifting ahead. "To people deciding who you are before you even speak," she said, and the words carried no anger, no bitterness, just a quiet honesty. And Brooks took a moment before answering, his steps continuing in that same measured rhythm. "You do not get used to it," he said finally. "You get used to not letting it define you." And the distinction landed gently but firmly, and Nia nodded slightly, absorbing that, her fingers brushing lightly against the fabric of her sleeve as she walked, grounding herself in the present moment. And after a pause she spoke again, her voice still calm, but carrying a deeper layer now. "I thought today would feel heavier," she admitted, "but it does not." and Brooks glanced at her again, this time holding the look for a second longer. "Why do you think that is?" he asked, and Nia considered it, her brow tightening slightly as she searched for the right words. "Because I did not lose anything," she said slowly. "I did not give anything up to him." And Brooks gave a small nod, the kind that confirmed understanding rather than introduced it. "Exactly," he replied. "You walked away with everything you walked in with." And the simplicity of that truth settled deeply, reinforcing what she already felt but had not fully named. And they continued walking, their steps steady, the quiet street stretching ahead of them under the soft glow of evenly spaced streetlights. And a car passed slowly on the opposite side, its headlights briefly illuminating their path before fading into the distance. And Nia watched it go, her thoughts shifting slightly. "Do you think he will remember this?" she asked, and Brooks did not answer immediately, his gaze forward, his posture relaxed but attentive, and after a few seconds he spoke. "Not the way you will," he said, "but he will remember enough." And Nia tilted her head slightly, considering that. "Enough for what?" she asked, and Brooks allowed a faint pause before answering. "Enough to hesitate next time," he said, and the words carried a quiet weight, because they were not about change in a dramatic sense, not about transformation, but about something smaller, more realistic, a shift in instinct, a moment of reconsideration. And Nia nodded slowly, understanding that, recognizing the value in it even if it was not immediate or visible. And they walked a few more steps before she spoke again, her voice softer now, almost reflective. "I did not want to prove him wrong," she said. "Not really." And Brooks glanced at her briefly. "Then what did you want?" he asked, and Nia exhaled, her gaze lifting slightly as if looking beyond the street in front of her. "I wanted him to see me clearly," she said, and the honesty in that statement settled into the quiet around them. And Brooks considered it for a moment before responding, his tone steady. "And did he?" he asked, and Nia paused, her steps slowing just a fraction as she thought about it, replaying not the words, not the confrontation, but the shift, the moment when his posture changed, when his voice lowered, when his certainty broke just enough to let something else in. And she nodded once. At the end, "Yes," she said, and Brooks gave a small nod in return, acknowledging that without adding to it. And the two of them continued walking, their steps falling back into rhythm, the quiet street holding them in a calm that felt earned rather than given. And after a moment Brooks spoke again, his voice softer now, less instructional, more reflective. "Clarity does not always come at the beginning," he said. "Sometimes it comes after everything else has already been said." And Nia listened, the words settling into her understanding of what had just happened, reshaping it once more, and she nodded slowly, her shoulders fully relaxed now, her breathing even. And as they moved forward under the steady glow of the streetlights, the moment behind them no longer felt like something unresolved. It felt complete, not because it had been perfect, but because it had revealed what it needed to reveal. And in that quiet, steady completion, Nia felt something settle into place inside her, something that did not need to be revisited, because it had already become part of how she would stand the next time, and the time after that, grounded, clear, and certain. The night had settled fully now, the sky deepening into a quiet shade of blue that blurred into black at the edges, and the streetlights cast steady pools of amber light along the sidewalk, guiding their path in a way that felt almost deliberate. And Nia could feel the calm inside her becoming something more stable, less like a reaction and more like a foundation, something she could stand on without effort. And beside her, Colonel Isaiah Brooks walked with that same unshaken presence, his steps even, his gaze forward, but there was a subtle shift in his expression now, something more inward, more reflective, as if the moment earlier had not just passed through him, but settled somewhere deeper. And for a while they walked without speaking, the quiet no longer needing to be filled, until the faint vibration of a passing vehicle slowed near the curb behind them, its engine low, controlled, and Nia glanced slightly over her shoulder, not fully turning, just enough to register the movement, and the vehicle came to a smooth stop a few feet away, the engine idling softly. And for a brief second neither of them reacted, because not every interruption demands attention. But then the driver's door opened, and the sound was familiar, measured, and Nia's steps slowed just slightly as she turned this time, her gaze steady, her posture unchanged, and Officer Daniel Reeves stepped out, his movements more restrained now, less rigid than before, as if he had left something behind when he drove away. And for a moment he did not speak. He simply stood there, a few feet away, the streetlight catching the edge of his uniform, and Brooks turned as well, his posture calm, his presence grounded, and the space between them held a different kind of tension now, not confrontational, not defensive, but reflective, as if something unfinished had quietly followed them down the block. And Reeves cleared his throat once, the sound softer than before, and when he spoke, his voice carried none of the sharpness from earlier. "Ma'am," he said, looking at Nia, his tone measured, deliberate. "I wanted to correct how I approached you back there." And the words landed carefully, not rushed, not forced, but chosen, and Nia watched him without interruption, her expression neutral, open but not inviting. And Reeves continued after a brief pause. "I made an assumption before I understood the situation," he said, and the admission was simple, direct, without embellishment, and that made it heavier, because it did not try to justify, it did not try to soften, it simply acknowledged, and Brooks remained silent beside her, his presence steady, allowing the moment to unfold without interference, and Nia let a second pass. Before she responded, her voice calm, even. "You raised your voice before you asked a question," she said, not accusing, not emotional, just stating what had happened, and Reeves nodded once, accepting that without resistance. "Yes, ma'am," he replied, and there was a slight pause as if he was choosing whether to say more, and then he added, "That was not the right way to handle it." And the statement settled into the quiet around them, and for a moment no one spoke, the city noise distant, almost irrelevant, and Nia studied him briefly, not searching for sincerity, but recognizing it in the way his posture had changed, in the way his voice no longer pushed, and she nodded once, a small acknowledgement. "Then you know what to do next time," she said, and the words carried no edge, no lingering tension, just clarity, and Reeves gave a faint nod in return, his shoulders easing slightly. "Yes, ma'am," he said again, and the repetition did not feel forced. It felt grounded, as if he was anchoring himself to that understanding, and Brooks finally spoke then, his tone calm, steady. "Awareness is the first step," he said, and Reeves glanced at him briefly, meeting his gaze with a level of respect that had not been there before. "Understood, sir," he replied, and the exchange was brief, but it carried weight, because it marked a shift that did not need to be emphasized, and the silence that followed was no longer uncertain, it was settled, and Reeves stepped back slightly, creating space without turning away, and after a moment he gave a small nod, first to Brooks, then to Nia. "Have a good evening," he said, and the words, simple as they were, felt different now, not procedural, not automatic, but intentional, and Nia nodded in return, her expression unchanged but softer at the edges. "You too," she replied, and Reeves turned then, walking back to his vehicle with measured steps, and as he reached the door, he paused briefly, glancing once more toward them, not out of hesitation, but acknowledgement, and then he got in, the engine humming quietly as the car eased away, merging back into the flow of the night, and Nia watched it for a second before turning forward again, her shoulders relaxed, her breathing steady, and Brooks glanced at her briefly, his expression calm. "That is how change begins," he said quietly, and Nia nodded once, the weight of the moment settling into something clear, something complete, and as they resumed walking, their steps aligned once more, the night around them steady and quiet, the lesson no longer unfolding, but fully realized. The sound of the patrol car faded completely into the distance, leaving behind a quiet that felt fuller than silence, as if the space itself had absorbed everything that had just unfolded and settled into a new kind of stillness. And Nia walked beside her father with a steadiness that no longer required effort, her steps even, her breathing calm. The earlier tension now replaced by something deeper, something rooted. And the street stretched ahead under the warm glow of the lights, each one casting a soft circle that they passed through without noticing, because their focus had shifted inward, and for a few moments neither of them spoke, not because there was nothing left to say, but because what mattered had already been understood, and Brooks glanced at her briefly, his expression thoughtful, measuring not the situation but her response to it. And after a few steps he spoke, his voice quiet, steady. "You did not hold on to it," he said, and Nia turned her head slightly, not fully, just enough to acknowledge the statement. "To what?" she asked, though she already knew, and Brooks exhaled softly. "To the part that could have stayed with you," he replied, and the words landed gently, not as a warning, not as a lesson, but as an observation, and Nia thought about that, her gaze drifting ahead as she considered the feeling she had carried when Reeves first raised his voice, the way it had pressed against her chest, the way it could have stayed there if she had let it. And she shook her head slightly. "It did not belong to me," she said, her tone calm, certain, and Brooks gave a small nod, acknowledging the clarity in that. And they continued walking, their steps aligned, the rhythm steady, and after a moment Nia spoke again, her voice softer now, more reflective. "I thought I would feel angry," she admitted, "but I do not." And Brooks glanced at her briefly, his expression neutral but attentive. "Why do you think that is?" he asked, and Nia took a breath, her fingers brushing lightly against her sleeve as she searched for the right words. "Because he saw it in the end," she said. "He saw me." And the simplicity of that statement carried weight, not because it excused what had happened, but because it acknowledged what had changed, and Brooks considered that for a moment before responding. "Recognition can release what tension holds," he said, and the phrasing was precise, measured, and Nia nodded slowly, feeling the truth of it settle into place, and they walked a few more steps before she spoke again, her tone thoughtful. "Not everyone will come back like that," she said, and Brooks did not hesitate this time. "No," he replied, "most will not," and the honesty in his voice did not carry disappointment, only reality, and Nia absorbed that, her gaze steady ahead. "Then what do you do with the ones who do not?" she asked, and Brooks let a brief silence pass before answering, his voice calm, grounded. "You leave them where they are," he said, "and you keep walking." And the words landed with a quiet finality, not harsh, not dismissive, but clear, and Nia felt something settle deeper inside her at that, a sense of direction that did not depend on others changing, and she nodded once, her shoulders easing further as the last trace of uncertainty dissolved, and the street opened slightly ahead, the sidewalk widening as they approached an intersection, the glow of a traffic light casting a soft red hue across the pavement, and they slowed. Naturally, stopping at the corner as a car passed through, its headlights briefly illuminating their faces before fading. And in that pause, Brooks spoke again, his tone softer now, almost reflective. "Moments like that," he said, "they test what you carry into them." And Nia turned slightly toward him, her expression attentive. "And what did I carry?" she asked, and Brooks met her gaze for a brief second. "You carried yourself," he replied, and the answer, simple as it was, settled deeply, because it reframed everything that had happened, not as something external, not as something done to her, but as something she had moved through with her own grounding intact. And Nia let out a slow breath, the kind that fills the chest fully before releasing, and she nodded once, her voice quiet when she spoke again. "That was enough," she said, and Brooks gave a slight nod in return, confirming it without adding to it. And the light changed, the soft red shifting to green, and they stepped forward together, crossing the street with the same steady pace, their steps aligned, their presence calm, and as they reached the other side, the moment behind them no longer felt like something that needed to be processed. It felt complete, not because it had been easy, but because it had been met fully, and in that quiet completion, Nia felt something solidify within her, something that would not need to be questioned the next time, something that would simply be there, steady, clear, and certain. The other side of the street felt quieter, as if crossing that intersection had drawn a line not just between two blocks, but between what had been and what no longer needed to follow them. And Nia noticed how her steps settled into something even more natural, no longer shaped by reflection or analysis, just steady movement forward. And the air carried a faint chill now as the night deepened, brushing lightly against her skin, grounding her in the present moment. And beside her, Colonel Isaiah Brooks walked with the same composed rhythm, his presence steady, his attention forward but aware, and for a while neither of them spoke, not because there was nothing left, but because what remained did not need to be said out loud. It had already taken its place internally, and the street stretched ahead under evenly spaced lights, each one illuminating the path just enough to continue without hesitation. And after a few seconds, Nia slowed slightly, her gaze lifting toward a small storefront window they were passing, the glass reflecting a faint image of the two of them walking side by side. And she paused for just a moment, not stopping completely, but enough to register the reflection, and something about it felt different, not in appearance, but in presence. And Brooks noticed the shift in her pace without needing to look directly. "What do you see?" he asked, his tone calm, curious but not probing. And Nia studied the reflection for a second longer before answering, her voice quiet, thoughtful. "The same person," she said, and then after a brief pause she added, "but not standing the same way." And Brooks gave a small nod, acknowledging the distinction without needing further explanation, and they resumed their steady pace, the reflection fading behind them as they moved forward. And after a few steps he spoke again, his voice measured. "Moments do not change who you are," he said. "They reveal how firmly you are already standing." And the words settled into her with a quiet clarity, reinforcing what she had begun to feel without fully naming it. And Nia let out a slow breath, her shoulders relaxed, her posture naturally aligned, and she nodded slightly. "I did not think it would be that simple," she admitted, and Brooks allowed a faint pause before responding. "It is not simple when you are inside it," he said, "only when you step through it." And the phrasing carried a calm truth that made her glance at him briefly, recognizing the difference between experience and reflection, and they continued walking, their steps steady, the rhythm unbroken, and the quiet of the street held them in a way that felt almost intentional, like space had been made for this moment to settle fully. And after a few seconds Nia spoke again, her voice softer now, more certain. "I kept waiting for something to feel unfinished," she said, "like I missed something." And Brooks tilted his head slightly. "And did you?" he asked, and Nia shook her head gently. "No," she replied. "It feels complete." And the word carried weight, not because it ended the moment, but because it closed it in a way that did not leave anything behind. And Brooks gave a small nod, confirming that without adding to it. And they walked a few more steps before he spoke again, his tone reflective. "Completion does not come from what others do," he said. "It comes from how you hold yourself through it." And the statement settled deeply, aligning with everything she had experienced. And Nia nodded slowly, her gaze steady ahead, and for a moment the only sound between them was the soft rhythm of their footsteps against the pavement, steady, even. And then she spoke again, her voice carrying a quiet realization. "I thought strength would feel louder," she said, and Brooks allowed the faintest hint of a smile. "It rarely does," he replied. "Real strength is often the quietest thing in the room." And the words resonated, not as something new, but as something confirmed, and Nia felt that settle into her, not as a lesson to remember, but as something already integrated, already part of how she moved. And the street ahead opened slightly, the buildings spacing out, the night sky more visible now above them, and the lights continued to guide their path without interruption. And as they walked, there was no need to look back, no need to revisit what had happened, because it had already become part of how she stood, how she responded, how she would move forward. And in that quiet, steady continuation, the moment no longer felt like an event. It felt like a foundation, something that would not need to be questioned again, something that would simply be there, present, grounded, and certain. The street opened into a wider stretch where the buildings gave way to a small park bordered by low iron fencing, and the night air carried the faint scent of grass and cool earth, grounding everything in a quiet stillness that felt almost intentional. And Nia slowed just slightly as they approached the edge of it, her eyes drifting across the dim outlines of trees and empty benches, the soft glow of a single overhead light casting long shadows that moved gently with the breeze. And beside her, Colonel Isaiah Brooks matched her pace without question, his presence steady, his silence comfortable. And for a moment neither of them spoke, because the need for words had faded, replaced by something quieter, something understood. And Nia stepped toward the fence, resting her hand lightly against the cool metal, feeling its solidity beneath her fingers, and she looked out across the open space, her breathing even, her shoulders relaxed. And there was no tension left in her posture now, no. trace of the moment that had once pressed so sharply against her. Only a calm awareness of what had been and what remained. And Brooks stood a few feet beside her, his gaze following the same direction, not watching the park itself but the stillness within it. And after a few seconds he spoke, his voice low, measured. "Most people think moments like that are about proving something," he said, and the words settled into the quiet air without disturbing it. And Nia nodded slightly, her eyes still forward. "I thought that too," she replied, her tone calm, reflective, and Brooks allowed a brief pause before continuing. "But they are not," he said. "They are about remembering something." And Nia turned her head just enough to glance at him, her brow softening as she considered that. "Remembering what?" she asked, and Brooks met her gaze briefly, his expression steady. "Who you are before anyone else tries to define it," he replied, and the simplicity of the answer carried a depth that did not need to be expanded. And Nia let out a slow breath, the kind that settles deep and leaves nothing unsettled behind, and she looked back out at the park, her reflection faintly visible in the darkened surface of the fence, and she saw what she had noticed earlier,